All right. Hello, everybody out there. Thank you again for tuning in to the Complete Solution Group podcast. This is going to be a great show. I mean, I'm super excited about the show. We have Peter Forcelli, an ATF agent who blew the whistle on management failure in the gun trafficking scandal known as Fast and Furious. You know, 2 assault weapons from Fast and Furious were recovered near where U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry died in a firefight with Mexican bandits in December 2010. Pete also appeared in front of Congress in June 2011 to testify against his supervisors, the ATF, and the U.S. Attorney in Arizona for failing to properly oversee the operation that lost track of as many as 2,000 guns along the southwest border. Martinez and I met Pete officially at the Voices of Fentanyl rally in D.C. this past September. You know, Pete is an amazing stand-up guy, and we're proud to have him on the show. Going to kick it over to Martinez and hear a little bit more.
Thanks, Fab, and Pete, thanks again. And, to all those that are listening, Pete's career, just looking at it, it's fascinating how he started off in New York City. And all of us, actually, I don't know, Pete, you're aware, we're all New Yorkers. So it'd be fascinating to hear the stories down in New York in the pre-Giuliani days, what was going on and how you got into deciding, you want to leave the city and join the federal government. And then after that, just your story of all that you did during 9/11, after 9/11, and where you are today. It's pretty remarkable. And the big news is coming out here in 2 months, I believe it's March 5th of 2024. You have a book called The Deadly Path, which I'm not going to lie, I pre-ordered it yesterday to see what's going on. I mean, it's just fascinating just hearing what it is. And with Fab and I, and as yourself working under these past administrations, we just see the shadiness of Obama, of what was going on. And to this date, it's still one of those mysteries that hopefully we'll get to hear the truth about. So on that note, Pete, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks for the invite. Great to be here with you guys. And it was a pleasure meeting you folks at the Lost Voices of Fentanyl rally. What I say is I always deeply respect talking to guys who are still on the job, upholding their oath to office. But just as much the folks who retire and realize their oath didn't come with an expiration date. So they're still out there doing good, which you gentlemen are doing. So I'm honored to be here, and I appreciate the invite. And yeah, as to the book, I name names because some folks weren't held accountable in that scandal, and they should have been. Some folks got punished that didn't necessarily deserve it, primarily the whistleblowers. But yeah, it's time for the truth to come out, because look, the reality is, if you don't know about history, you're bound to repeat it. And that case, as bizarre as it was, is something that could be repeatable. So let's hope that doesn't happen again. But yeah, I appreciate you guys having me on the show.
Yeah, Pete. So if you want, how tell us how your career got kicked off. I mean, how did you ended up deciding? I'm always fascinated about when people decided to make that dive into law enforcement. What was what was that calling? Is that something you knew as a kid, or how did you end up becoming a New York City police officer?
Well, I actually started with the New York City Housing Authority Police, which was a great job. So we patrolled the projects. A lot of people around the country don't realize New York back in the day had 3 different police departments: New York City Housing, New York City Transit, and the NYPD. Giuliani came in and merged them all together. But I mean, I grew up always wanting to be a cop. I watched Starsky and Hutch as a kid. David Soul just passed like last week. God rest his soul. Kojak, all of those great shows. But I remember when I was a little kid, I lived in the border of Yonkers and the Bronx. And I remember, it sounds kind of sick when you think about it in hindsight, but there was a shooting on my block. I grew up in not a great neighborhood. It was a narcotics detective shot a drug dealer. And I don't know if he died. I was a little kid at the time. But I thought it was the coolest thing how, because they had the crime scene tape up, and I'm not saying shooting the guy is cool, but just how like the cops were the only people that were allowed on the other side of that tape. So it was like those guys knew. Those guys had some kind of special power, and they controlled the scene. So growing up and seeing that as a little kid, I was always intrigued by policing. And then I fell into the false sense that it was like TV shows, like real exciting all the time. And then every case gets solved in 42 minutes when you factor in commercials. But you quickly learn that's not the case. But anyway, Giuliani merged the departments together. So by the time I left housing, I was a detective. They kept me in the detective bureau, which was great. Spent my last 5 years in the Bronx Homicide Task Force. And it was there we started working on federal cases. And it was weird because back in those days, when I started, the Bronx averaged like 600 murders a year, which is kind of scary when you think that the Bronx is just one county, right? 5 boroughs are each their own county. And by the time we left, the numbers were around, well, when I left, it was around 200 a year. My partner and I retired on the same day. That's why I said we. But it was, I would blame federal prosecution for the success, frankly, because a lot of the really bad guys were used to going into Rikers Island, making friends, coming out with better connections, so they were better criminals. So when we started taking some of those folks out of that rotation and sending them to Allenwood or Lompoc or Leavenworth or wherever, crime went down and people started to fear getting locked up by the feds. And it was weird because my last year with the NYPD, I had a homicide case from before I was in the homicide squad, actually, because regular detective squad homicides too. A 4-year-old kid named Joseph Dalphin was beaten to death by his stepfather. He had soiled himself. Stepfather changed him. The kid was special needs, soiled himself immediately again. So the guy went into a rage and beat the kid to death. So that he got sentenced to 4 years in prison for that because he pled that he, mental duress or whatever. And it was during that same time where we were taking felons in possession of firearms and taking them federally to flip them and proffer them and find out about what they knew about all these different groups. And even with cooperation, some of those guys were getting hammered. So I remember having a defendant who gave us a lot of information on a case, the sex, money, murder, racketeering case. And he got hit with 4 years. And I was like, what am I doing here? Why am I even, because I mean, they could have stopped letting me work on federal cases and then I would have had to go back to that grind of taking stuff to the Bronx DA's office. And I just realized I could have a bigger impact if I jumped ship and went to the feds. And back in those days, I worked a lot with DEA. In fact, I think we have a mutual friend, Derek Maltz, legend. Still, I mean, if you go to the DEA office space in New York, Derek's been gone for 20 years. If you mention his name in the hallways there, people light up because he was just such a respected leader. And another guy who's still in the fight, upholding his oath many, many years after retirement. So, but working with the ATF folks, because back then it was customs was different. It was customs, INS, ATF, FBI, DEA. The ATF folks were the ones we worked with the most, and they kind of lulled me into, hey, come on over. So eventually I took the test, the Treasury Enforcement Agent test, which was brutal. A lot of math. I suck at math. And I wound up getting the job. And I started my federal career in New York, which was great because I was doing the same work in the same areas with a different badge in my pocket and a crappier salary because I took a pay cut for the first couple of years, but it was all good.
Yeah, Pete, I was, when I first got on the job, I was on the job with Federal Protective Service in downtown Manhattan in 96 through 98. And, as a kid growing up in New York and watching that crime wave that came up through the city in the 80s into the early 90s, what did you see as the biggest difference under Giuliani, which really started to take a lot of that lower level crime out? And then, for me, I feel like taking a lot of that lower level crime off the street actually stopped a lot of the higher level crime that was going on. And, we did see a change in downtown New York. And even when I was there working law enforcement in the mid 90s, I mean, that change was very apparent. I mean, people were starting to go to Broadway again. It was just, the change was easy to see. What did you see that you saw was a big difference in making the crime rate go down?
Well, look, I came on under Mayor Koch's tenure, and he was very supportive of police. But things were getting out of control. If you remember, that's around the time Edward Byrne got gunned down. He was assassinated, which was unheard of. I mean, other than back in the days of Piagentini and Jones and Foster and Laurie, where there were executions at the hands of the BLA or SLA, you didn't hear about cops getting assassinated. So Eddie Byrne got assassinated, and it was actually the first police funeral I went to. So we had the support of politicians back then, which is something that you just don't see now. Right. Now cops are disposable to these folks. They love us when they need us, and then when they don't, they could badmouth us to get votes, which is sad. But so Dinkins wasn't bad in that he was bad to police. He just wasn't very supportive of police as Koch was, but he didn't go gunning for cops either, like what you see today. What happened with Giuliani is Giuliani came in with Bratton. Bratton was a dynamic leader. I mean, there was a guy who he would visit precincts on the midnight shift. So he had that trust that he bought, or rather, earned from the local cops by just being there and by just supporting cops. And Giuliani supported cops too, but it's kind of weird because a lot of cops resented him because he was also very financially prudent and he didn't want to give us raises. So they had T-shirts, zeros for heroes, because we had like a 5-year contract. It was 0, 0, 0, 2, and 3 or something. So, but yeah, what happened was everybody that committed a violation was arrested because the belief was the turnstile jumper is possibly a guy that's wanted for murder, or the guy who committed a traffic infraction could be wanted on a warrant. So it was basically, to go out there and just deal with every little crime, because the belief is if you didn't pay attention to the little stuff, the big stuff would continue out of control. And it worked. I mean, some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, for example, where, we took the murder rate from 600 to just over 200, it came from aggressive prosecution. Because look, I get it. There are some folks who get caught up in things that make honest mistakes. Those folks generally aren't going to jail. I mean, these are all kind of left-wing talking points. Like, look at all the people sitting in jail for personal use marijuana possession. That just doesn't happen. I mean, it rarely does it happen. But for the most part, for folks to sit in a New York City jail or for us to take them federally, they had pretty extensive rap sheets. In fact, there was one guy who we took federally for some grocery store robberies. We charged him with the gun possession and the Hobbs Act robbery. He had 92 prior arrests and 16 prior felony convictions. And the Bronx DA's office was finally like, hey, man, we can't put this guy away. Can you guys help us? And we did. But yeah, I mean, the thing that troubles me now is, even back prior to Giuliani, elected officials supported law enforcement, but there was always kind of, hey, let's not go after the low level stuff. So crime kind of spiraled out of control. Going after broken windows theory policing worked. But we've gone in a completely different direction now where you have felons getting a pass and we see what's happening. The violence is unspeakable and folks feel empowered to go out there and commit crime now. To your point earlier, John, when I grew up in high school, you didn't go to Times Square unless you were looking to go to like a strip club or you're looking for drugs. It was an open air drug market. Then, towards the end of the Giuliani years, Times Square was a place where you took your kids to go to the Pokemon store and whatnot. Now, I was there about 3 months ago. I didn't feel safe. And this is after 35 years in a law enforcement career, working in some pretty bad areas. I was like, wow, this place is just as bad as it was back in the early 1990s, late 1980s, because they've just lost control because prosecutors just don't care anymore. And that's who it is. It's the prosecutors. Yeah. They're the gatekeepers, really.
No, for sure. I mean, you can build up a case, but if it's not going to get prosecuted properly, I mean, and plus, I mean, it just kind of depletes the morale of the agents or officers who are working that case, and to see how much time and effort you put into it, and then the prosecutors put no effort into trying to help you put this guy in jail. So yeah, I mean, it's New York is such a an awesome, very different place. Like it can be amazing at times. And, for all of us having, grown up in New York, I mean, we sometimes we took it for granted, but people from all over the planet come to New York to see it. And it's just, when it's like it is now and it's so unsafe and, the crime rate is up, it's not something anyone that really believes in New York and believes in the spirit of New York, it's not something that they really want. I mean, they want New York to be safe, and they want it to be that place where people from all over the world come to see the vision of what New York can totally be.
Right. Well, look, the other thing where I take it personal is I lost friends during that time. I mean, I lost friends in the line of duty, and it's not even including 9/11. And it's almost like that, to me, I that loss is in vain. You don't give back that ground. And what bothers me too is, look, maintaining order is not always pretty. I mean, we've seen it. We lived it, right? Deadly force happens. Yeah. It's not always not justified. In fact, rarely is it unjustified. Using force that's not deadly force sometimes doesn't look pretty, especially on camera. But that's why they call it necessary force. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's necessary. But so all of these folks that have demonized the police and have kind of convinced them that, the use of force is a bad thing, right? Eventually the pendulum is going to swing. And while maintaining order is not pretty, restoring order is far uglier, right? Because, I mean, now you have folks that feel empowered to fight it out with the cops or to shoot it out with the cops, where that wasn't the case when there was this maintenance of order. So eventually, when the pendulum does swing, I think the sad part is that some of these elected officials who have blood on their hands aren't going to realize they could have even more blood on their hands when people have finally had enough. And that's the tragic part, in my opinion. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of tragedy in this, but that's one of the tragic parts.
Yeah, Pete, the one thing too, as a kid, I went to college in Staten Island at Wagner for a couple years. And then I headed back upstate to finish out my career. And I just remember, walking through New York City then, it wasn't too bad. It wasn't like at a Charles Bronson movie. But nowadays, you go look at New York City, obviously with this influx in migrants just coming over there. Now they're kicking kids out of school. I know the residents of Staten Island are protesting buses coming in. I mean, New York City's taken that turn for the worse, where it's it's sad to say, because New York City, in my opinion, is like one of the greatest cities in the world. Where once you go there, you actually see what man can do, and the way the city operates. But now it's almost like in the point of chaos, because like you said, the rule of law, obviously what's going on our borders now is impacting New York City. And just talking with friends when we were still working, just some of the law enforcement policies how that they have now, where we were hearing the craziest things, where like in New York City, the only way law enforcement will hold you in custody is like if you committed murder. Pretty much if you haven't done anything that bad, they're kicking you out the door. And it's one of those things where when it comes to illegal immigration or guns or drugs, it's going to get so much worse faster. And it's that's the sad part of what's going on with these policies. And like you said, the blood is on their hands, and now they're starting to realize these sanctuary policies that they have aren't designed the way they want it. Like they're sanctuary when it's one or two people. When it's thousands every day, all of a sudden sanctuary is not what they want. And during your career, were you involved with any immigration experiences?
Well, I didn't work for INS, but there were plenty of times where we would work with INS. I remember there was a guy named Tom Kilbride. Everybody knew Tom Kilbride. He was an INS agent in New York, again, before they merged all the agencies together. Good dude. But look, I had one case that stands out. I had a case where it was Dominican kids, illegal aliens. They were in the U.S. They weren't kids by the time they came into our, line of sight. But there was one guy, his name was Nice Bello. He ran a home invasion crew. And it was funny because the home invasions were a big thing in Upper Manhattan. I don't know if you folks remember, because that's where all the drug stash spots were. And so we would arrest home invaders, and they were almost aghast. Like, how come you arrested me? How come you guys haven't picked up Bello? So we were like, who the hell is this guy Bello? So eventually we were able to get into Bello. And like I said before, we charged him with firearms violations. We proffered him. We flipped him, started to infiltrate his crew. In the end, it was 23 defendants, over 145 home invasion robberies, 6 murders, kidnapping. And these were primarily illegal aliens. They were here illegally, right? They made money initially selling drugs. Then they realized, well, wait a minute, if I'm paying for a few kilos and then just making profits, why not go rob the other drug dealers, and then everything we sell is entirely profit? And it was weird because then they started to partner up with some Albanian organized crime folks, and it went from robbing drug dealers to robbing jewelry stores, robbing a bakery. They robbed Roberta's Video City, an old video store up in Yonkers, New York. So yeah, I mean, but that's why I laugh when people say, "Oh, illegal immigrants don't commit crimes. It's this group or that group." Well, yeah, everybody is different. People from within all different factions of society that commit crimes, but to give them a pass is not true. And look, when I was in the homicide squad, a lot of the murderers that we went and chased down, we'd have to go to the DR to bring them back, because they would flee there because that's where they were from. And again, New York, the migrants from New York back in those days. I mean, you had in Corona, you had Colombians, and in Jackson Heights, you had Colombians. Washington Heights, I believe, had the highest Dominican population in the United States. So I mean, yeah, these folks would come here. A lot of them would work, honest jobs, drive cabs, own bodegas, own, you know, lucrative businesses, but some of them didn't. So, and when I look at what's going on now on the southern border, it blows my mind. And look, I talk to people. I worked on the border for 5 years. I don't have the border knowledge you gentlemen have. I did deal with some cartel related cases. I went down to Mexico a lot, prior to that whole Fast and Furious mess, Mexico City, Hermosillo. Mexico had a lot of corruption problems that makes it really hard for them to stop the drugs coming in here when they're all on the payroll. In fact, I had a friend who was the head of the Mexico office back in the day, Carlos Canino, great guy. he used to tell me, caution me, because we would travel into Mexico to meet with Mexican law enforcement folks. And his thing was, hey, any Mexican municipal police department operate under the belief that you are dealing with the uniformed enforcement arm of whichever cartel owns that particular part of the country. And here's the other thing. I remember when we were working cases on the border, and that just didn't involve firearms trafficking. We had a couple of cases that involved explosives trafficking. It was scary to go down there and to deal with Mexican law enforcement because you didn't know who to trust. But, what I always was taken aback by is occasionally we would run into folks who were vetted, like they'd received polygraphs. They built up some trust with us. I had such deep respect for them because they didn't know if they were going to get shot from the guy standing in front of them or from a colleague that was on the payroll of the cartel behind them. But yeah, things have gotten so far out of control. Like CJNG, which we now know is huge. In fact, last year, my understanding is they made over $4 billion just in tobacco smuggling.
Incredible.
That's not even their primary business. For them, that's like a side gig. But look at it. They're driving around parts of Mexico in armed caravans, marked, right, of armored vehicles,
fully
wearing uniforms.
Yeah,
carrying state-of-the-art weapons. Like, at what point do we in the United States wake up, and I don't mean like people like us, I mean like elected officials, and say, hey, there is an imminent threat on our doorstep, right? And they're making a shitload of money with narcotics trafficking, with human trafficking, right? I mean, that's big business for them. And with all the other little things, like I said, the tobacco trafficking is a side gig. Who knows what else they're involved in? And the other thing is they are international conglomerates now. They're working with other entities all over the planet. From what I'm hearing, guns from what we've given to the Ukraine are showing up in Mexico. I understand that guns that were left behind in Afghanistan are showing up in Mexico. The only thing that could be more absurd is if it was to find out, and I'm not saying that I have any knowledge that this is the case, but if I were to find out that Victor Boot was the one that was brokering these deals, I guess I wouldn't be surprised. But it's terrifying because, people like to talk about, military grade weapons, and they like to point fingers at the AR-15 and the AK-47 variant rifles here that are sold. Those aren't military grade weapons.
No.
But the cartels are getting their hands on military grade weapons from elsewhere. And then the other thing is what they do is they take the firearms that are purchased here that are civilian versions of rifles that are, semi-automatic rifles, one pull of the trigger. You guys know this. One pull of the trigger is one bullet. It's not a machine gun. Well, they're taking those guns once they're trafficked to Mexico, and they have armorers who are turning them into machine guns. But what concerns me is that you have folks that like to point fingers at people up here and point, at our Second Amendment right, number one, but also at the gun industry as if somehow it is some sort of gray market where, they'll sell you one gun over the table, three guns under the table, wink, wink. That's not the case. And when I was working the Southwest border, my agents relied on firearms dealers, licensed dealers, for 90% of the information that we got involving firearms traffickers, felons trying to buy guns, and unlicensed dealers who were selling guns, for profit, who shouldn't have been. So right now, if you look at what's going on, the administration is going after the gun industry when I just think that that's counterproductive because they were such valued partners. It's almost like, the saying, never leave a man behind. In my opinion, we've left a man behind when it comes to the gun industry by demonizing them instead of just, working with them the way we did.
Absolutely. Hey Pete, since you mentioned it, let's talk a little bit about Fast and Furious. Let's get into that since it's a big part of who you are, and just for the audience to kind of give them it maybe they heard about it but really don't know what occurred there. So what happened with Fast and Furious that led you to going in front of Congress and blowing the whistle?
Well, combination of things. Fast and Furious was a case that started in the Phoenix Field Division in 2010, and it involved a case where they were letting guns go to Mexico, not stopping them, not interdicting them, and they were tracing that information because guns are traced, and a trace is like basically the gun is found at a scene. Somebody will call ATF and say, "Hey, this gun was found. Can you trace it?" And ATF will call the manufacturer. Right? These are phone calls. There's no database, so it's like, "Hey, did you make this gun? And who did you send it to?" So then they'll call that wholesaler or retailer. Who did you sell it to? Well, I sold it to Pete Forcelli. So that's the first time that gun made it into like the retail market. It was sold to Pete Forcelli. That's all they're going to get out of that. Now, if Pete Forcelli is a trafficker, then there's other things that you hope that your investigation will show you, but it's going to take you to that first retail purchase. So what they were doing is they were using that information to try to build a case in their minds that they were going to take down a cartel. Now, what was delusional to me about that is you look at DEA had this vast network of informants in Mexico. They had vetted units. They had the narcotics trafficking laws, right, which are powerful. I mean, we've seen the prosecute people from Afghanistan for opium trafficking, for example. Never before have they ever used straw purchasing laws to take down a cartel. So again, it was a bit delusional to think that they were going to do that. And the firearms trafficking statute didn't even exist back then. So they'd use these compilations of being engaged in a business without a license. Nothing that carried a substantial enough sentence to warrant extraditing foreigners from other countries to bring them here to face justice. So, but prior to that, for years, when my group was focused on Mexico-bound firearms trafficking, what was going on is we would get calls from the dealer, right? We would roll out because we'd be like, hey, I'll give you an example. Like my first weekend out in Phoenix, we got a call I didn't get the call. One of my agents gets a call from the dealer saying, hey, a guy just walked in here. He's a little shady. He's got a bag full of money, paper bag full of money, rolled up 20s and 10s, right? The drug dealer bankroll. And he asked how many AK-47 variants we have on the shelves, and they had 13. And this guy said, I'll take them all. So, the dealer's like, hey, can you come out here and, we'll make this transaction. Can you stop them? So there was 3 scenarios that unfolded before Fast and Furious. One is that scenario we would roll out there, but the transaction would happen. Maybe sometimes we would send an agent inside on the cover to watch so he can tell us when this person was coming. Oftentimes it was just the dealer himself on the phone. Hey, he just left. He's in the blue shirt, putting the stuff in the silver car. So, but we would seize those guns after asking questions, stopping the car, right? Building up the probable cause. Oftentimes we had probable cause before that person even set foot in the car. Sometimes the dealers would call us and we would be tied up with another takedown or something. Something else was going on. And the dealers say, hey, man, no worries. We'll just delay the sale. We'll say he didn't pass NICS or whatever. Or final scenario would be the dealers would call and say, hey, we're not available. Can't do it tomorrow. All right, we're not going to make the sale. But it was never like they would make the sale and then call us later. I mean, because that's what some folks will try to tell you. It was, the dealers made their money. No, they often called us in putting themselves in harm's way, mind you, because you're dealing with cartel people while the stuff was happening. So, but because we were seizing the guns as they were leaving the store, those guns would never be traced because there was no need to trace them. We knew where they were sold, right? So what happened is when Fast and Furious started, the dealers who were, again, calling us without fail, there was only one corrupt dealer that we investigated and that the U.S. Attorney's Office wouldn't prosecute that case, which is a whole nother story. So, but anyway, the dealers weren't getting those trace requests. So they felt comfortable because they knew what was going on. And those guns that we would seize weren't going to the hands of hunters or people who were going to target. They were going to the hands of the cartels. So all of a sudden, when Fast and Furious starts, the dealers start to call us and say, hey, man, like, we don't get what's going on. Like, why are our guns all of a sudden being traced, right, from Mexico? Like, they were starting to get upset. The dealers, again, not agents, not prosecutors, civilians, the dealers. So what happened is they started to protest saying, hey, we don't feel comfortable selling these guns anymore. We want to stop. So folks from the chain of command that I work with in the ATF Phoenix Field Division, and again, this was one group. This wasn't all of ATF Phoenix. This wasn't my group or the group next door. This was a group that sat in a different building, different chain of command, different ASAC. So what happened is they went and met with the dealers. And so did the U.S. Attorney's Office, right? And said to the dealers, hey, man, you guys are supporting a very important case. Keep selling. So the dealers keep selling, right? Because they're being told to by ATF and by federal prosecutors. Well, the numbers go up. 600, 800, 1,000 guns. Finally, when the numbers were up somewhere near 2,000 guns, Brian Terry gets killed, right? So now Brian Terry dies. And at this point, word starts to circulate in the field division about them walking guns because we didn't know it back in our office space what was happening with that case. So at a subsequent meeting, the head of the Phoenix Field Division basically said, hey, John Dodson had blown the whistle because Brian Terry got killed. He's the first agent that stepped forward courageously and contacted Senator Grassley's staff. So at the meeting, Special Agent in charge says, don't be surprised if you hear that John Dodson may be getting indicted by the U.S. Attorney's Office, right? Now, the weird thing is all of those cases that I spoke about before with the interdictions that we were doing, we would get confessions. We would have documents in hand to show that they bought this. We would present those cases to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they would 90% of the time decline them. So here I'm sitting in this meeting, and when we had some pretty egregious cases, I mean, with bodies on them that were declined for prosecution, and now I heard a rumbling that the U.S. attorney's talking about indicting John Dodson, who blew the whistle after Brian's death. That's when I contacted Senator Grassley's office and said, "Listen, I know you're being told by Holder and by ATF and by all the people in the DOJ that ATF doesn't walk guns. John Dodson's not lying. Subpoena me, I'll tell you everything you want to know." And I explained how we had all of those cases previously, where we couldn't get anybody prosecuted, and now they're talking about prosecuting John. And that's how I got involved in blowing the whistle, because it was just what was happening out there was wrong. I mean, look, when we could take a case to the county, we did. When we could take a case to the state, we did. But the reality is, we were federal agents. We should have been making federal cases. And a lot of civilians don't realize, and you guys probably dealt with it in your travels, some U.S. attorneys' offices are great. Some are mediocre. Some suck. But federal prosecutors can, unlike state prosecutors, can say no. You can bring them a great case, and if it's not in what the U.S. attorney's vision for that office is, they can decline some pretty serious cases. And in Phoenix for 3 years, I saw a lot of very serious cases being declined. In fact, I get into the weeds on that extensively in my book. And we even had a grenade case where there was a guy who confessed to making over 800 grenades for the Sinaloa cartel, who got caught with grenades in his car crossing the border, and we were ordered to let him go. And the sad part is, like, as you guys know, sometimes there's an underlying state or local violation that you can always fall back and take it to the local prosecutor's office. Well, with disassembled grenades without the explosive component, because that wasn't present, the U.S. Attorney's Office was the only game in town. So by the time we actually were able to get this person in custody, which was after the scandal hit, and they realized, oh shit, people are looking at us, this guy who admitted to making over 800 grenades for the cartel made hundreds and hundreds more. So, and he was running a school in Mexico to teach the cartel folks how to make grenades. And also he was converting the AK-47 variant rifles into, fully automatic rifles, and the same thing with AR-15s. So he was, in essence, the armorer to the Sinaloa cartel, but we weren't allowed to arrest him. So I get into real explicit detail on that case in the book as well. But it's mind-blowing.
Yeah, it sounds like the book is going to be just unbelievably awesome. So for those of you listening out there, look, go order this book. You're going to learn a lot of great stuff. You're going to learn more about Fast and Furious. You're going to learn, a lot of great things that Pete talks about in the book. And it's just information that needs to be out there. It needs to be in front of the American public. And, go out there, buy the book for sure.
Thanks.
And Pete, the one thing too, just to kind of wrap this up, and hopefully you'll come back, because I think we just scratched the surface. There's so many layers to this that, just for those listening, definitely, get the book and listen, because the guns weren't just a U.S. problem. These guns were killing civilians in Mexico. They were in a terrorist attack in Paris, France, at a concert going on. So, I mean, we're just scratching the surface. But like I said, Pete, it was great talking to you. And like I said, hopefully you have time. We'd love to pick this up and see where else this leads to.
No, I'd be honored to come back on. Like I said, I respect guys who did the job and who, hold on to that oath and continue to do, good things. And in fact, John, I know you're running for office. Don't know if this is the proper place to say it, but you have my 100% support, because we need men with courage and integrity in politics right now, because that's something that's sorely missed. So I don't have much juice, brother, but I'll squeeze out whatever I have to help you, because I think that you'd be great. We need more folks like you in office.
Thanks, Pete. I really appreciate that. It's going to be a long uphill battle for me to win this office, but you know me, man. I'm going to be in that fight 100% of the way. So thank you. Good. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right, Pete. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Stay safe, guys. Thank you.
Bye.
All right, Pete, if you can just hang out for a second, it's just uploading your audio. And what we'll do is next.